Okay, so in the last two lectures, we've discussed the problem of incomplete information, and we've discussed how a combination of incentives to misrepresent and a noisy environment and a first strike advantage may lead to bargaining failure and may lead to a breakdown and may lead to countries choosing to use military force as opposed to resolving their disputes through bargaining. So this idea that war is a mistake, and this idea that war comes from being unable to read each other's intentions and resolve, and from states signaling and from states locking themselves into conflict. Those ideas, again, were not necessarily ideas that were theoretically articulated in the US foreign policy establishment, but they are ideas that are in the US foreign policy establishment, even if they aren't formalized. So if we look at how the United States has designed its international security posture, oftentimes it is done with the idea to try to avoid these types of mistakes that might lead us into conflict. So a lot of what the United States has done in the basically since the creation of the liberal order is to try to signal and to try to communicate to states what they can and can't do, and to try to communicate to states if they choose to initiate a crisis, what is likely to happen. The intent of this is to reduce uncertainty. The intent of this is try to create a system where the United States is predictable, where you know that if you engage in particular behaviors, the United States is likely to respond favorably or is likely to respond negatively, and you know that certain behaviors are likely to be risky and certain behaviors are not likely to be risky. This idea was to try to minimize this problem of uncertainty. If you minimize the problem of uncertainty, in theory, states can read each other's intentions, they can read each other's resolve, and particularly with the United States, they would know that the United States has particular assets and particular capabilities, so they'd be able to understand that. And the United States has always emphasized maintaining overwhelming superiority there, so they would know that the United States would have superiority in its ability to respond, and that they would understand that the US would be resolved in trying to respond to particular threats. So, just as an example, during the Cold War, the biggest concern of America's European allies was that the United States would not ultimately defend Europe from a Soviet attack. So, the United States put structures in place to try to assure the Europeans that if the Soviets did attack, the United States would defend them, even though it was easier for the United States to retreat to its borders. The intent of creating those institutions, those alliances, those structures was to try to reduce these problems of uncertainty. The Europeans would understand that the Americans would defend them. The Soviets would understand that the Americans would defend them. And therefore, the Soviets could avoid entering into crises that might escalate to World War III, as it would be after World War II. So, to try and understand these things theoretically, let's pull up the slides for today. What we're talking about is ways to overcome the information problem that we've identified over the last two lectures. Again, recall, the problem is that states cannot adequately read each other's resolve and read each other's capabilities, and that there's a first strike advantage. What this does is, in bargaining situations, encourage states to misrepresent and encourage states to tell their adversaries that they're more powerful than they actually are, and to try to communicate to states that they're willing to fight when they may not be. And if these messages are sent, there may be incentives on the part of all parties involved to use first strike advantages and start conflicts, which are a mistake. Nobody wants to actually do that. Everyone's better off trying to resolve their disputes short of war, but we may end up in these conflicts simply because of a mistake. So to try to mitigate that, let's think about how we might adopt two types of deterrence. On one hand, let's think about if we're in a crisis, how do we de-escalate? How do we try to push that crisis down so we don't see escalation? And once we get that, then we want to understand the other part of this, which is how do we stop states from creating crises in the first place? How do we just take away the problem of crises? So the central problem, once we're in a crisis, let's talk about that first. This is a situation called immediate deterrence, right? How do we immediately deter a crisis that may escalate the conflict? The central problem here is that one state may not believe that the other one will follow through on its threats. So as an example, again, the United States might claim that if the Soviet Union tried to take control of Berlin, the United States would defend West Berlin and would escalate to World War III. Now, if we think about that, that's a very strange threat, right? why would it be the case that the United States would escalate to World War III to defend half of a city that was completely surrounded by East Germany anyway, right? And why would the United States risk itself to defend this half of a city? Why would the US do that? If you think about it that way, it's pretty hard for the United States to convince the Soviet Union that it's actually serious. But that's exactly the challenge that the United States had. Deterrence requires the United States or any state to convince their opponent that challenging the status quo will result in conflict, even though no side wants to escalate to conflict. In order for this to work, a threat has to become credible. And a threat is only credible if the price of not following through on it is costlier than the price of following through on it. So we talked last time about audience costs and how you put your reputation on the line and you try to create these reputational costs, and at some point it's going to be more costly to back down than not. But that's escalatory, right? That's something that might cause crisis to escalate and escalate and escalate, as we saw in the case of the Second Iraq War. And when we're dealing with something like deterrence, what we want to do is to try to avoid escalation to the greatest extent possible. So we have to try to send a signal to try to communicate that any form of escalation is likely to be met with some form of a response, which in theory should take away this escalatory process so we don't have to use public threats, so we don't have to tie our hands, so we don't have to get committed and forced into war as a result of audience costs. So how can we make threats credible in order to maintain the status quo once a crisis starts? Well, we can use a couple of different mechanisms. In 1954, U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles created something that was known as the threat of massive retaliation. Dulles claimed that any act of aggression that the Soviets engaged in would be met with a disproportionate response, including nuclear weapons. So if the Soviets took any action that appeared threatening the United States would unleash its entire nuclear arsenal, right? And it could be small. It wouldn't, if the Soviet Union took any small action, the United States was willing to use its entire nuclear arsenal. The idea being that the consequence of any form of aggression would be so high that the Soviets would not dare do it. Now, that threat doesn't seem credible. Right, if we think about this, if the Soviets were to deploy some forces close to Berlin, was the United States going to really unload its entire nuclear arsenal? This is really a credibility problem because threatening nuclear retaliation may not be reasonable, right? Or going through with nuclear retaliation may not be reasonable. Threatening it is all fine and good. But if going through with it is not reasonable, then the threat is not reasonable itself. Would you really, again, from the American perspective, would you blow up the world to save Berlin? Wonderful city, important city, strategically critical city, but would you destroy the entire world to defend it? And if you can't follow through with that threat, there's no point in making it because it's just not credible. What has to be done is that if you're going to issue any sort of a threat, there has to be some credibility behind it. And ideally, you want this threat to be clear before crises start to escalate, right? So we don't get to the point where rhetoric binds us into conflict. So how then can we create a situation where states make threats credible? Well, there's two mechanisms, right? On one hand, there's the idea of sinking costs, which is you spend a whole lot of resources, which you pay regardless of whether or not the crisis escalates or not. The idea being there is that you spend so many resources that your adversary knows that you're serious. So one way of trying to look at that is tripling your military budget. You increase your defense expenditures. Maybe you buy a whole bunch of tanks and you continue to buy tanks and you buy more tanks. And so with purchasing all these tanks, you spend all these resources with an idea being you tell your adversary, look, I'm spending all this resources on tanks. You should know that I'm serious. The other option is to use something that's called a tying hands signal. The idea is that if you are challenged, if there's any challenge to the status quo, the response is effectively out of your hands. A classic example of this is something called the Doomsday Device, which was something that was parodied in a movie called Dr. Strangelove. If you haven't seen it, it's a really interesting movie and it's funny and it illustrates some of the key aspects of deterrence. The idea of the Doomsday Device is that if it were the case that the United States were to launch or planes from the United States were to move over Soviet territory, an automatic nuclear response would be triggered. And that response was irreversible. There was nothing humans could do to try to stop that nuclear strike. Now that sounds like madness, and it is. Taking control of the nuclear strike out of the hands of a human being and basically giving it to a doomsday device, where the doomsday device is going to look at the threat and just launch. If it thinks anything is wrong, that seems like craziness, right? A pilot could go off course. A pilot could accidentally fly into Soviet airspace. Does that warrant a complete unleash of the Soviet Union's arsenal? Probably not. But think about what that does. What the United States then knows is that if anything goes wrong, the decision is not going to be in the hands of the Soviet leadership. The Soviet leadership will not be able to reverse that signal, will not be able to reverse that threat to unleash their entire nuclear arsenal. And if that's true, the United States is going to be a whole lot more careful in trying to threaten the Soviet Union to the point where they may not do it at all. That's how deterrence can work. That's how the tying hands signal can work, is that it takes the response out of the hands of the decision maker. It puts it in the hands of the challenger. Therefore, the challenger sees that there is absolutely going to be a response, and the challenger shouldn't challenge, right? Because they know that the decision is out of the hands of the decision maker. So let's think about how both of these strategies may work. Let's first think about sinking costs. Now, does this work? Well, if the United States spends a whole bunch of money on tanks, for example, those costs are going to be paid regardless of whether or not the United States follows through on its threat, right? So if the United States responds to any sort of threat with a strike, right, if it responds with any sort of threat with a strike, it's going to pay the price of nuclear retaliation and the price of building up all these tanks, right? But if it doesn't respond, it still pays the cost of building up all these tanks. So if on one hand, the United States is going to pay the price of nuclear retaliation and tanks, and on the other hand, it's just going to pay the cost that it pays for tanks, it's better off going to just paying the cost it's going to pay for tanks and not the nuclear strike. What this tells you is that sinking costs just doesn't work, right? Sinking costs, in a sense, doesn't convince anyone. If we follow this out and we follow the logic of it, on one hand, if I spend a whole bunch of resources, and on the other hand, I spend a whole bunch of resources because sinking costs, I pay this regardless whether or not I escalate or not. So those resources are sunk, but then I have to pay the cost of going to a nuclear strike. I'll choose the other option. So the strategy of just trying to convince your adversary that you're serious by spending a whole bunch of resources, that's not going to be convincing. On the other hand, tying hands will. Let's suppose, go back to the doomsday device idea, that the US were to create such a thing. And the US actually did think about creating such a thing, like a doomsday device. If the Soviets were to engage in aggression, the device would be triggered, right? And a nuclear war would happen with certainty. If the Soviets did not engage in aggression, nothing happens. So once the Soviets make their choice, the US can't control its response. The response is taken out of its hands. The US's hands are tied. They cannot reverse the response. If the Soviets trigger the doomsday device by engaging in aggression, we see nuclear retaliation and the US can't reverse it. The threat is therefore absolutely credible. If the threat is this credible, right, if the Soviets know that the United States is going to commit to full release, total release, if any sort of aggression happens, they should be deterred, right? We've taken away the information problem. We know that the United States is going to follow through. And in effect, we've taken the decision away from the United States and put it in the hands of the challenger. If the Soviets choose to challenge the status quo, they can expect nuclear retaliation with the tying hand signal. That's the essence of how it works, is that it takes the decision out of the hands of the decision maker. And as a result of that, the threat becomes completely credible. Now, if you're following this, what you should understand is that this is madness. This is crazy. Whenever you start to get into nuclear discussions of nuclear strategy, you'll quickly find it turns crazy really fast. And this is just another example of that. But that doesn't mean that the logic of tying hands can't work for deterrence. What if you could figure out something short of total nuclear release that wasn't as extreme and that wasn't as dangerous in case something was errant or something goes wrong? What if there was a way to try to tie the United States' hands into defending Europe, given that the United States would have every incentive to retreat back to its borders if the Soviet Union was to engage in aggression? Well, let's think about alliances. Right? George Washington once warned of being engaged in entangling alliances, right? But maybe entangling alliances are something that communicates information. It's a problem if the United States actually has to follow through with these entangling alliances. But one thing alliances can do is tie the hands of policymakers. And although they're often derided as unreliable, there's been recent studies, several studies, and when I say recent, it's actually over the last 10 to 15 years, that indicate alliances are quite reliable. One of my professors at Rice University is named Dr. Brett Ashley Leeds. She is a leading scholar on alliances. Most of her work demonstrated that alliances effectively work like contracts, and that most of the time states follow through with their obligations that are listed within the contract. Right. And so what the alliance does is it's designed to impose costs on a state if they do not fulfill their obligations. States voluntarily enter into these alliances that impose costs on themselves if they don't follow through with their alliance commitments. And so as a result of that, states tie their own hands into following through with their alliance commitments. Now, how might they do this? Well, let's think about NATO as an example of this. This is an example of, and perhaps one of the more famous alliances that are out there, and a critical alliance to the U.S. security posture. Now, as we mentioned before, the United States has a severe credibility problem during the Cold War in defending Western Europe. If the Soviets were to attack Western Europe, it would be very easy for the United States basically to say, we don't want to get involved. Moreover, because defending Europe would require a nuclear exchange, which would mean a nuclear attack on American cities, there's all the incentive in the world to abrogate this commitment. And the Europeans know this. And so why should they trust the United States? Why would they trust the United States to defend them, given that there's every incentive in the world for the United States not to defend them, especially when you also consider that the Soviets have a larger conventional military in Europe. So what the United States does is come up with this interesting strategy. They deploy American forces into areas that are dangerous, right? One of them in particular was West Berlin, which again was completely surrounded by East Germany, so completely in communist territory. If there were an attack on Berlin, even though that the United States are there, even though the United States is there, it's a small contingent. Their supply lines would be quickly cut. The only way to get to them would be through air. And so a Soviet attack would almost certainly overwhelm the Americans that were in Berlin. It doesn't matter how good they were, and they were good. They would be overwhelmed at some point in time by the Soviet Union. So think about that. The United States was effectively making their soldiers lambs for the wolves, right? It was putting American soldiers in a position where they would be killed instantaneously if a war erupted between the United States and the Soviet Union. They would be gone. They would be killed. Why would you do that? Well, what this does is tie the U.S. hands, right? An attack by the Soviet Union on West Berlin would be killing American forces. And that means an attack by the Soviet Union on West Berlin puts the Soviet Union in a war with the United States. At that point, there's no turning back, right? Because American forces are there, if the Soviets attack Berlin, the United States is at war with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have made that choice. That would compel the United States to use its nuclear arsenal to defend its forces that come under attack. So by placing its forces in harm's way, and the US effectively, credibly promises to defend Western Europe, that's the purpose of that alliance. That's the purpose of deploying Americans this way, out that way. And if we want to think about the advantages of NATO, right now there's a lot of question about the cost of NATO. Right now there's a lot of claims that NATO is not worth the money. What NATO actually looks like it was at the end of, at the start of the Cold War is an investment in basically trying to prevent any sort of future war within Europe. NATO linked all of the European countries under one security umbrella and provided for this collective defense if any one of them were challenged. They were all linked militarily, all of their equipment is compatible, and it places American forces there, which guarantee that American forces will be engaged if Europe is attacked in any way. For that price, the US bought peace in Europe for 50 years, right? For a long period of time. If you compare the cost of maintaining NATO to the cost of another World War II or potentially World War III, that actually doesn't look like a bad investment, right? If we really think about it that way. So by placing American forces there, and by paying the government the cost of putting American forces there, and by integrating the American forces with the European forces, and by putting them in harm's way, the United States effectively bought decades of peace because the Soviet Union did not want to engage the Americans and understood that if it attacked in Western Europe, or if it attacked Berlin in particular, it would be at war with the United States, which was not something it wanted. So why do this, right? How exactly does this work? Well, we can see that this is useful in providing deterrence in crises, right? The Soviets understood that there was a limit to what they could do. If they chose to escalate in Berlin, they would be initiating World War III. And so that produced deterrence. What NATO also did was produce efficiency and security, right? Because in a sense, every unit was combined. What the United States was able to do was enhance its military capability in Europe, its assets in Europe, as were every other NATO member. Right? Every NATO member was able to enhance its overall assets and its ability to deter the Soviet Union. So, as an example of this, if we think about Germany and we think about Britain, probably at the early stages of the Cold War, neither country was capable of deterring the Soviet Union. But by integrating with the United States, they were, right? They gained that ability to defend against the Soviet Union. And the same is true of the United States. The United States can't defend against the Soviet Union, can't defend its interests against the Soviet Union without partners in Europe. So, because it can't deploy the forces there. So, by deploying forces there, the United States wins in its ability to deter the Soviet Union, and those countries win because they also gain the ability to deter the Soviet Union. So this is what we can look at as a joint production of security, right, which can also produce efficient security, right? So just as an example, we can think about some other alliances here, like the Triple Entente between Britain, France, and Russia, right? By integrating their forces, they were able to produce efficiency in trying to contain Germany and Austria. Now, how exactly did that work? Well, if we look at three alliance partners, Britain's advantage did not lie in conventional military forces. It didn't lie in its army. What Britain had an advantage in was its navy. So Britain had naval power. France and Russia had manpower, right, from being on the continent. And so if an alliance emerged here with the Triple Entente, France and Russia were able to draw on the naval assets of Britain, where Britain was able to draw on the ground assets of France and Russia. And so where each state specialized in what they did best, they were able to use comparative advantage and produce more security, right? So another aspect of this, alliances tie your hands into responding to crisis, which in theory deters a crisis. It also produces more efficient security. So for each dollar you spend, you gain more in return, right? You, in theory, gain maybe $1.10, whereas previously you would gain $1.05 or something like that. So it produces more efficient security that way. Now, oftentimes with the United States, right, unlike the Triple Entente, where the alliance partners are relatively even in terms of power, for the United States, typically what happens is that we have one strong power being the Americans, and we have a weaker power. What that is typically characterized by is something called the security autonomy trade-off. What that means is that if the United States provides security to one of its allies, to one of its partners, it oftentimes gains autonomy over their foreign policy. In the Cold War, the United States gave security to Western Europe. It gained autonomy in the sense that none of these countries were going to adopt communist governments. And that same agreement extended to many other states during the Cold War. During the War on Terror, the United States has provided security to many states. In exchange for that, it's gotten agreements from these states that they're not going to incorporate several terrorist demands like kicking the Americans out or undermining American access to natural resources. So what you see here is that there's an exchange. The United States will gain security, and since the country partnering with the United States gains security, the United States gains autonomy. Another example of this is the U.S. alliance with Japan. The United States provided Japan with security, right, after World War II. In exchange for that, Japan has basically ceded autonomy over its foreign policy to the United States. So that's the exchange that happens here. Oftentimes with alliances, the United States provides security, right, and takes the burden of doing that, but it gains autonomy over the foreign policies of its partners. Now, again, go back to what the United States gains from NATO. By providing security to all the European states, the United States gained considerable autonomy over the foreign policies of each of these states, which meant that they, A, weren't likely to go communist, but B, weren't likely to fight each other either, right? So again, the investment in NATO is something that not only provides a foreign policy gain in deterring the Soviet Union, it provides peace amongst the members within Europe, which again, compared to the cost of World War II, you could look at as a worthwhile investment. This is a key part of what the United States was trying to do. It reduces uncertainty because everyone knows that the US is locked into Europe, but it also provides efficiency amongst the members and reduces potential conflicts amongst them. It provides the United States with autonomy in exchange for security. Now, we can think about some other examples of this. Let's think about the US-Saudi alignment. There is no formal alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia, but there has been an alignment that everyone knows about. Right? And it goes back to the Roosevelt administration, where Roosevelt basically told the Saudis, keep the oil going and we will protect you, right? So the United States has long provided the Saudis with security. In exchange for that, Saudi foreign policy tends to closely align with the United States. These two states are very heavily integrated. I would invite you all to go look at the Saudi embassy in DC and compare it to other embassies, and you'll see just how integrated the Saudis are with the United States. What this has also done is give the United States considerable influence over Saudi oil policy, right? And since the Saudis and the United States are very linked when it comes to this, recently we've seen some fractures in that, right? We've also seen some fractures in the alliance structure in the world, but the United States has had traditionally considerable influence over oil matters in the kingdom, right? And so the Saudis gain security given to them by the United States, which they needed. They're a small kingdom. They have a lot of territory to govern. And in exchange for that, they cooperate with the United States in terms of foreign policy objectives. So this is a tool for stronger powers like the United States to spread their influence. But what it requires is that these stronger powers also defend some of these smaller powers, which in theory is supposed to reduce the uncertainty and reduce the threat to these smaller powers and provide peace. In theory, that's the idea, right? This provides a costly signal, a time-hand signal that's intended to maintain the sovereignty of the smaller state, which is Saudi Arabia, and maintain the status quo globally, which is beneficial to the United States. Now, if we think about this, those are some of the benefits of alliances, but there are several potential costs to both partners, right? To both the United States and its partner. One of the costs involves abandonment. Typically, the United States doesn't abandon state allies. The United States often abandons non-state allies because they don't have standing. That happens. But occasionally, the United States has abandoned, not often, but has abandoned some of its state allies. So as an example of this, think about the end of the Vietnam War. President Nixon had promised, right, that even though the United States was scaling out of Vietnam and reducing its troop presence, that South Vietnam's sovereignty would be defended in perpetuity with air power, right? And Nixon fully intended to fulfill U.S. security obligations. But then Nixon is forced to step down. Gerald Ford enters into power. And by the time the invasion starts from the north into the south, Nixon's gone and Ford is not willing to intervene. And as a result of that, South Vietnam falls, right, and is abandoned by the United States. That can happen. Right, that's a cost of aligning with the United States. On one hand, the gain from South Vietnam is that the South Vietnam gains security of knowing that the United States would be there, right? But there's a risk that the United States might not be there, right? As much of a tying hand signal it is, there is this risk that the United States might just say, we're done, and pull out, right? There always is that gamble that it's there. A second problem really relates to what the partner state can do to the United States. Right, so this is a situation that's known as moral hazard, right? Moral hazard is interesting. It's a concept that derives from insurance, which means that if you have insurance, your habits tend to get worse than if you had no insurance, right? So the idea being that if you had no health insurance, you'd be forced to take care of your health. If you have health insurance, you know that the costs of healthcare are going to be paid by a third party, and therefore you can drink, you can smoke, you can eat stuff that's not good for you. You're more free to engage in behaviors that you would not otherwise engage in. With automobile insurance, the argument is that if you don't have automobile insurance, you drive very carefully. I happen to know that that's true. But if you do have automobile insurance, you can become a very bad driver, as I am, right? And you can space out, not pay attention, drive when you're tired, etc. So that can increase the risk that you engage in an accident, but you can do that because you know that the costs of paying for that accident are going to be borne by the insurance company and not yourself. That's the idea of moral hazard. Now, how does that work when it comes to alliances? When the United States partners with weaker states, because these states have the US security guarantee, they can become more bellicose in international relations. They can start to take more risks because they know that if things go wrong, the United States will defend them. Theoretically, since the weaker party has an alliance, it may become more aggressive. Alone, it may face an adversary where it's quite weak and is therefore unwilling to challenge that other adversary. With a partnership with the United States or another power, suddenly it looks a lot more powerful and it's going to be much more willing to initiate disputes. So, as an example of this, you can think about the US and Taiwan during the Cold War. Since the Taiwanese, Chiang Kai shek's party was defeated by Mao Zedong and forced onto the island of Taiwan. So they were clearly weaker than the Communist Party within mainland China. But once it was the case that the United States was willing to defend them, and the United States indicated it was willing to defend them, they started to become much more aggressive. They started to demand that they would declare their own independence, that they were the true representative of China. They also started to engage in military operations, guerrilla operations against mainland China. And that's dangerous, right? Because that could potentially escalate very, very quickly. But because these states had an alliance, because since the partner state had an alliance, it could do such a thing. You can also look at Israel's willingness to pursue settlements in the West Bank. They would not do this if they did not have an American security guarantee, right? The fact that the United States will always be there and defend them allows them to engage in more aggressive behavior toward the Palestinians, right? Which is what we might call moral hazard, right? Alone, Israel might be forced to come to some compromise with the Palestinians, but because they have the American security guarantee, they're free to engage in much more bellicose behavior. So that's another consequence of having these alliances, is that we have situations that might lead to entrapment. And a third type of problem that might emerge is where one side's dependence on an ally might allow the other side to abuse the dependent party. Now, for an example of this, think about Pakistan, right? As the war on terror escalated, it's very clear that Pakistan is an essential ally for many reasons. One, Pakistan was, in a sense, bankrolling many of these groups that the United States was fighting in Afghanistan. So getting them to stop that was essential. The second part of it is that if the United States wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan, if you look at the map, you'll see that the United States can't do it without using Pakistan as a conduit to get troops into Afghanistan. There's only two ways into Afghanistan. One is through Pakistan. One is through an air corridor that goes over Russia. The other is through Iran, and the United States was not going to be able to get that one, right? Iran was not going to cooperate with the American presence in there, right? So in that sense, the United States was going to need Pakistan. Now, if that's the case, and Pakistan knows that the United States can't live without it, Pakistan might have incentive to be less than cooperative, right? Also, if it realizes that it's getting assistance, security guarantees from the United States so long as the war on terror goes on, it might not have an incentive to ever end the war on terror, which might be an explanation for why bin Laden was not that far from the Kabul military academy, that he was in Abbottabad. Again, there's no confirmation that the Pakistanis were actively protecting him, but it looks suspicious. Right, it looks like the Pakistanis were not terribly interested in getting rid of bin Laden because as long as he was there, as long as Al-Qaeda was there, as long as the United States is fighting the Taliban, as long as the United States is fighting the Haqqani network, which is clearly aided by Pakistan, the United States was going to be willing to continue providing Pakistan with security guarantees and money. This created an exploitative dynamic that was there, right? So there are these three problems associated with alliances. Let's take a step back and try to recap this. What alliances are intended to do is reduce the uncertainty so we minimize the onset of interstate crises. And they can do that, right? They do that by tying the hands of the United States and signaling to a potential aggressor that if they engage in an attack, the United States will respond. Theoretically, if the United States' hands are tied, as they were in West Berlin, the aggressor should avoid entering into such a crisis in the first place. And again, if we go back to the example of the Soviet Union, the Soviets should not threaten any NATO state, right? Because it's understood that if you attack a NATO state, you're going to be fighting the entire thing, which is also fighting the United States. Interestingly, if you look at current Russian foreign policy, the Russians have behaved aggressively against Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, but have not yet engaged aggressively against NATO members, right? again, that suggests that the signal is actually working, that if you're tied into NATO, that's a signal that you should not escalate a crisis against NATO members. So those types of alliances can be useful in reducing uncertainty and reducing noise, and they can produce more efficiency and security, which make all parties more powerful. Those are the good things of alliances. The downside is that you get these other costs associated with it. There's the risk of abandonment, there's the risk of moral hazard, right, and entrapment, and there's the risk of exploitation. So in order to make this work, right, in order to make alliances work, the parties have developed ways to try to overcome some of these three problems. The way you overcome some of these three problems is to develop something called governance solutions, right? So from NATO's example, one way to prevent abandonment is because NATO's military forces are integrated, right? That all of their equipment synchronizes together, right? American forces deployed within NATO. It's hard to extricate yourself from NATO. And as a result of that, there's joint exercises taken together, et cetera. There's joint decision making. So for that reason, it's going to be hard for the United States to completely pull itself out of NATO. Interestingly, again, the Trump administration has been somewhat hostile towards NATO, but they haven't pulled out. Right? It's been difficult for them politically to pull out because strategically, the United States is heavily tied into the security arrangement, right, which makes it more credible. So the key to maintaining these security relationships are something called governance costs. Governance costs are intended to facilitate cooperation, which is going to produce greater and more efficient security, but they make it more expensive for one or both of the sides to abuse the agreement. Right? One way that the United States has done this also is to adopt reviews of human rights. You could make the case that the United States selectively applies human rights standards, and it does, right? But one thing that human rights do is it controls for things like moral hazard, right? In some of its alliance proxies, providing these states with weapons might encourage them to abuse their population more. But if the United States promises to review what they're doing and review whether or not they're abusing their population, that might restrain them from doing that, which would allow the United States to gain the advantage of having an alliance, but prevent some of the negative externalities of alliance, which encourage abuse, like moral hazard, etc. So those are some things that alliance can do to provide positive externalities. They provide deterrence, they reduce uncertainty, and they can theoretically deter crises, but they also produce these negative externalities. Now, one thing you can do to try to avoid some of these negative externalities, in addition to develop these governance solutions, is to maybe try to develop alternative mechanisms so that you can avoid crises altogether. Collective defense, which is provided for by alliances, might be one way of providing deterrence. But what if you could develop a system of rules and a system of order where countries could work through these institutions, work through these rules, and basically forego the willingness to enter into crises? That is the motivation behind the creation of international institutions, right? International institutions are supposed to create a series of norms, of expected behavior, and of rules that states are supposed to follow, right? What they also do is establish something called collective security, meaning that if any of these norms, if any of these rules are violated, then all of the collective, right, every state would identify the offending party and would threaten to sanction or punish them, right? If we follow collective security, if rules of an institution are followed, crises may be avoided altogether. But if any state decides to actually initiate a crisis, every state would oppose them. So that's the idea of providing collective security. Collective defense, one party guarantees the security of another. The United States guarantees the security of NATO countries. The United States guarantees the security of Saudi Arabia. That's collective defense. Collective security, everybody is tied into this idea of rules and norms. Everybody opposes a violation of rules and norms. Everybody is in it together to oppose aggression. So these institutions typically are taken as a foundation of global governance. What an institution is, in theory, what a good security institution would do, there are many, many different types of institutions. Let's focus on security ones. What they would do is arbitrate disputes so that neither side feels compelled to use force. Rather than threatening another state with military force, the state could go to the UN, right? And the state could demand a review of a particular issue. The UN could review the issue. And if the UN reviews the issue and makes an arbitration ruling, that arbitration ruling should, in theory, be binding, and the state should agree to abide by that. So the sides should be given legitimacy to voice and resolve their disputes regardless of their actual power. Any state, regardless of how weak it is, can bring a dispute to the UN. Additionally, the UN should provide protection, right? If the UN makes a ruling, the UN will enforce the ruling. All sides will be in a situation where they don't have to fear each other. So if the UN or any other institution can work as an arbitration mechanism, and that arbitration mechanism is going to be fair, that looks like a more appealing alternative to force, which in theory should reduce the number of military crises that are out there, right? So just as a really crude example of this, one time, right? If we just think about how individuals in Chapel Hill, for example, initiate disputes with one another. One time in one of my houses, my neighbor put a satellite dish on my property. Now, if I were to think about initiating a military crisis, I could have just smashed the thing and made sure it got off my property. But if I wanted to follow institutions and rules, what I can first do is approach my neighbor. If my neighbor didn't respond, I could call the city. The city would then make a ruling as to where the property line was. The decision would be made. Both of us would likely respect it, and the satellite dish would be removed. That's the civilized way of doing things. That's the institutional way of doing things. And if you apply it to states, that avoids a military crisis where I smash that satellite dish into pieces, right? Or in the case of states, I attack another country to try to resolve a territorial dispute. That's the basic idea behind collective security. Both myself and my neighbor, if either one of us did something like that, like smash the satellite dish, both of us would think it was appalling, as would the entire neighborhood. So we don't do that. If we think about how that applies to international politics, if anybody uses force, if anybody engages in a tactic of aggression, all of us would think that that's unacceptable. All of us would oppose that. So because everybody's opposing it, that reduces the belief among states that they can get away with this by initiating crises. It signals to them that there's a lot of power against them if they do that, and it signals to them that the entire international community is resolved to punish them, which in theory should deter them from initiating any form of crisis. That's the basic idea behind collective security, and that's how it works through international institutions. The institution that is clearly responsible for collective security today is the institution that came out of the aftermath of World War II, which is the United Nations. One thing you might argue, and I think it's not entirely unfair, is that sure, states work like that, right? The local government of Chapel Hill can stop me from destroying my neighbor's satellite dish and can resolve that dispute. Sure, state governments can do that. Federal government in the United States can do that. Can the United Nations really do that? It doesn't have a monopoly on force. It doesn't have a military force to enforce its decisions. It's weak, right? There's not one single power that decides what happens in the United Nations. And there's a lot of powers with vetoes, right? There's 5 permanent members. They all have vetoes over what the United Nations does. And so oftentimes, because of that veto, the United Nations won't do a whole lot. It's weak, and it was designed that way, right? After World War II, the Allies designed the UN to prevent any one country from becoming preponderant over the other, right? The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are the winners of World War II. They designed it in a way where none of them would become more powerful than the other one. And that prevents any sort of action from happening. So although in theory, the UN would provide a way to facilitate disputes, would resolve disputes between states, would ameliorate disputes between states, and would provide security for everybody, although in theory that's how it works, in practice it often does not work that way, right? It often doesn't work that successfully. Having said that, if we look at the UN's empirical record, they do a good job in a lot of cases of fulfilling those types of functions. Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes it's more difficult, but oftentimes they are able to fulfill these functions and do what we've discussed as far as collective security, right? What the UN also has done is outlawed this idea that states should resort to force whenever they feel like they're under threat. And I can demonstrate that to you in a couple of different ways. Just take a step back and think about this. If a state were to attack another state for whatever reason, would you think that that's acceptable? Probably not, right? And what that means is that the UN's rule that aggression should not be tolerated, that has had an effect, right? Socially, most of you have been socialized to believe that it's not acceptable for a country to go attack another country for whatever reason. It wasn't always that way, right? But because of the UN, that norm has been socialized. Ask yourself this other question. Is it acceptable for another country to go grab a piece of another country and say that that's mine now, right? Could another country annex territory? Probably most of you, if you saw that, would say that that's unacceptable. And why is that? Again, that's the norm of the UN filtering through. Those norms are not unique to the United States. Those norms are everywhere. If that's the case, we can see this concept of collective security entering into our consciousness, right? We can see collective security happening globally, right? That people look at acts of aggression and say that that's not acceptable, right? That's not tolerable. That forms the spaces of collective security that if any state engages in aggression, they're going to be opposed by everybody. So let's think about the two ways in which we can reduce uncertainty, right? If it's the case that the inability to read each other's power and the inability to read each other's resolve and these first strike advantages, if those are what's causing crises, we can look at alliances and institutions, alliances being a representation of collective defense and institutions being a representation of collective security, as strategies, mechanisms, institutions that are put in place to try to mitigate this problem. That has been a central feature of US foreign policy since the end of World War II. So from the collective defense perspective, from the alliance perspective, how do we overcome this problem of uncertainty? How do we overcome this problem of not being able to read each other's power or resolve and first strike advantages? Well, one thing we can do is bind states into defending each other in crises. So we know that if one state is attacked, it actually is going to have quite a bit of power behind it. What that also does is produce efficiency in the production of security, which again increases the power of the state that's tied into the security alliance. What we can also do that's not listed here is that if multiple states are tied into the security alliance, their autonomy to engage in disputes with each other, that's being taken away. So that also mitigates crises. And what we can also do is deter escalation of these crises by maximizing the collective power, right? If we're all in this together, if it's powerful, if an alliance is strong and we have strong commitments amongst each other, external aggressors may be less willing to challenge that particular alliance. Taken together, that helps solve the information problem. We know these states are tied together. It helps solve some of the problems with misrepresenting power. It's clear what the power of the alliance is. And that way, it can reduce the incentive to strike first amongst potential aggressors because, even if you do strike first, you're dealing with a very formidable force. That's collective security. Or that's collective defense, excuse me. For collective security, the idea is to stop these crises from materializing in the first place, to stop anyone from even considering using military force, and to try to get them to resolve their disputes through peaceful ways. Institutions provide the rules to do that. Institutions provide a settlement mechanism. These are a series of procedures that are in place that states can follow if they want to engage in peaceful change. And because alliances are in place, you're more likely to get your way. You're more likely to get some concessions if you do the peaceful route through an institution and trying to escalate the military route. Not only is the military route going to be costly because of alliances, not only is it clear that the alliances will be fulfilled because of alliance obligations and because of these ties between these different parties, what institutions also do is effectively tell any potential aggressor, if you do engage in that type of behavior, collective security norms will mean that it's you against everybody else, right? Instead of that, there is a dispute mechanism in place, there's a dispute resolution mechanism in place, there's procedures to resolve your dispute, there's procedures to voice your dispute. No matter how powerful or weak you are, you can do that, which allows for procedures to be put in place to, in theory, prevent crises. So this creates rules, it creates expectations, and it creates norms of state behavior, again, all of which decrease this problem of uncertainty, decrease this problem of first strike advantages. They're intended to try to take that off the table. These are the two ways that if we have war being a product of information problems and first strike advantages, we can try to resolve some of these issues by mitigating the amount of uncertainty, by mitigating the effects of uncertainty. These have been central to the US defense posture since World War II. And what they're intended to do is not escalate disputes. What they're intended to do is try to produce peace by reducing this information problem or by responding to this information problem. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. This is the last talk we're going to have on the information problem, so to speak. What we want to do in the next part today is to talk about another rationalist explanation for war, which is the commitment problem. Just full disclosure, if we look at how the field has developed over the last several years, the information problem was the central focus of political science studies and the central focus of those trying to study why we saw war, basically until the early 2000s. After that point, there's been a much greater focus on commitment problems, which we're going to discuss. And when it comes for since time to focus on your papers, the commitment problem is likely a much better explanation for the dynamics between the United States and Iran. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture.